Hello, everyone. My name is Chris. I'm also known as Eris Turtle Dev in the MonoGame community. And today in this tutorial, I would like to kind of do a deep dive into how to create a content pipeline extension for MonoGame, specifically when you need to import content through the MonoGame Content Builder Editor, also known as the MGCB Editor. When you need to import content through the editor, that is a custom type of content and not one of the types of content that you can normally import out of the box, like a texture or sprite fonts or audio sound effects, things like that. Um, it could be a little daunting creating a content pipeline extension. It's not very well documented as of right now on the website or really in many tutorials out there. So I have created an entire tutorial series on doing just this. That goes into a deep dive on it, and this video is just supplementary material for the tutorial for those who would prefer to watch or listen to a video in the background than read a full text dump tutorial that I've written. So that's what we'll be going over today in this video. But before we get started with that, I would like to remind everyone who's watching this, if you are new to using MonoGame or you are not new, you're an old member, you've been using MonoGame for a while, you did not know there is a Discord that we use for MonoGame. Here is a QR code that you can scan that will take you, this should launch directly to the invite for the Discord. We are very active on the Discord. We're always willing to answer any questions that anyone may have and help out where we can. We sometimes the issues are a little crazy, a little hard to figure out, but we will do our best to answer any questions and help you and encourage you with any project that you're currently working on. Uh, so scan the QR code, join the MonoGame Discord, come by, say hi, introduce yourself, and join the community. We're a lot of fun. Yay! Anyway, let's move on with this tutorial, shall we? So, like I mentioned before, I did write a full tutorial on doing this. It's quite the text dump. I know not everyone's going to want to read through a text dump for a deep dive into creating a MonoGame content pipeline extension tutorial, which is fine. That's why this video exists, so you can just listen to my voice in the background while you're off doing your coding things or whatever it is you're doing while you're listening to me talk. But for the most part, I will be following through my tutorial that I've written and going through the steps that are in that tutorial. So with that out of the way, let's get started, shall we? The first thing, actually, let me bring the tutorial over. So the purpose of this tutorial is to provide an overview of the workflow known as the content pipeline and how you can create your own custom extension for the MGCB editor to process and load custom content types that are not supported out of the box by MonoGame. And to keep the scenario simple for this tutorial, the extension that we're going to be creating is going to be one that loads JSON files. Now, typically, JSON files aren't really something you would load in through the content pipeline or do any type of processing with, since JSON files themselves are typically very small, and C# natively has things like the system.text.json namespace in order to read JSON files directly. So you really don't get too much benefit by importing JSON files, but I've chosen to use JSON file importing as the example in this tutorial because JSON as a file format is generally well understood by most people, and it allows us to focus this tutorial on the concepts of creating the extension rather than working with some complex file type. So that's why specifically we're going to be using JSON as we go through this. So the first thing that everyone needs to understand when you're creating a content pipeline extension is how the content pipeline workflow works. So I've created this handy little graphic here for everyone to look at. If you're listening to my voice in the background, now would be the time to kind of just peek over at the video real quick, just to kind of see this. So generally, it's kind of misunderstood by most people when the term content pipeline is used. Typically, when people hear the term content pipeline in MonoGame, they think the MGCB editor, which is just the front end GUI tool that allows you to edit the content file. The editor itself is not the content pipeline. The content pipeline is actually an entire workflow um, for importing, processing your game assets, and then writing them out into an XMB file. And then the other side of that content pipeline workflow is at runtime in your game, when you tell it to load it using the content.load method, which calls a content reader to read that specific type of content, that specific XMB file, and then return back a whatever type you were trying to load in. So for example, you can see in the image here that I've created, we have our image.png file that we pass in through the MonoGame Content Builder. And when it goes through the Content Builder, it first goes through an importer that imports the contents of the PNG file. That data is then passed to a processor, which does processing on that data that it imported, doing things like compression or changing the format to something more suited for the platform that it's going to be loaded on, things like that. Processing the file, it processes. The data from the processor is then passed to the writer, which writes out the binary encoded XMB file. So this image.png file goes through the entire MonoGame Content Builder and produces our XMB file. Now, when we tell our game projects to build, this is another part of confusion that some people have. When we tell our game projects to build, MonoGame has a NuGet package that's automatically added to your projects called the MonoGame .content.builder.tasks NuGet. And what this NuGet does is, well, part of what it does is it's going to take all of your XMB files that have been built by the MonoGame Content Builder, and it's going to copy those files from their build directory to the output directory for your full game project build. So those XMBs get copied there, and then during runtime of our game down here, we use the content manager to actually load these files in. So we'll call the content load method, specifying the type that we're going to load in, like a texture 2D here. And then that in turn calls the appropriate content reader that reads a texture 2D from an XMB file and produces the actual texture 2D instance, which gets returned back to us to use as a texture in our game. So this is the entire content pipeline workflow. It's not just the MGCB editor by itself. It's not just the content manager in our game that we use to load the content. It's the entire process going from our original file all the way through the MonoGame Content Builder to build the XMB file, and then the runtime piece to actually load the file in. So it's important to understand that how this content pipeline workflow works. So as we create our content pipeline extension, we know exactly what we're doing and where we're going to be, what each part of our code is doing to the file as we import it. So with that out of the way, the rest of the tutorial is the text dump on the page. So instead of going through the text dump on the page, we're actually going to go through this live and create our extension project and set up all the files and everything we need from there. So let's do that. Let's move this window here out of the way. And we are going to open Visual Studio. Here we go. And we're just going to create a new project. The project we're going to create specifically right now is the MonoGame Content Pipeline extension. I have it over there on the left. I can just click it, but I'm going to scroll down like you guys would do. Right here, the MonoGame Content Pipeline extension. This is the project we want to select right now. This is the project that's going to allow us, the template that's going to be set up to get us started with creating an extension for the content pipeline. So choose this, hit next, and give your project a name. Specifically, since ours is going to be a JSON importer, I'm going to name this JSON content pipeline extension. If I can type. Can't type. There we go. And we're just going to hit create. And we're going to make our project. So here we go. Off the bat, we can see over here in the Solution Explorer that it gives us an importer class file and a processor class file, both named importer1 and processor1, which is not very descriptive. These are terrible names for class files, but it's what the template gives us. You'll also notice that we get a lot of other files like this CPPNet DLL, this libmojo shader DLL, and a lot of other dependency files. These kind of clutter up the Solution Explorer window. These files are needed, but we don't need them while we're developing. We don't need them cluttering up our window here. So there's a really easy way to hide all those files. What you can do is double click on the JSON content pipeline extension project. And then right here at the end of the file, we're going to add a little bit of XML. This XML is included in the tutorial that I have written on my website. I'm just going to copy and paste it here. But what this does is it's going to tell it to remove the CPP.NET DLL, the libmojo shader DLL, any of the MGFX stuff, and any of the SharpDX stuff from our list over here in the Solution Explorer. So once we add that in and we hit save, there we go. Look at that. The Solution Explorer has now been cleaned up and is much easier to deal with. So let's close this out. And we're going to want to rename the importer and the processor to something more descriptive than just importer1 and processor1. So let's click on the importer. I'm going to hit F2 so I can rename, and we're going to call this the JSON content importer. And we're going to click yes here, and we're going to do the same thing for the processor. Call that one JSON content processor. There we go. All right, so now we've got the foundation of our content pipeline set up. So let's start with the importer. Let's go through that and discuss exactly what we see here when we open this default importer template that we've been given. So the first thing you might notice if you're not familiar with them is this using statement right here at the top. It says using t import equals system.string. So this is what's called a using alias. If you're not familiar with them, I do have a link in my tutorial that you can use to go find out more about what using aliases are in the C# language. But basically, the short of it is that we are creating an alias for system.string called timport. So anywhere in our code down here, like the return type right here for this method, the generic type here for the content importer, anywhere that we use the keyword timport, it's an alias for actually saying system string. So that's how using aliases work. The MonoGame templates for the content pipeline extension will set up using aliases for both the importer and the processor. We'll also use one for the writer as well. It helps us keep things simple, helps if we need to refactor our code, we don't have to make a lot of changes everywhere. We can just change the one alias and it kind of filters out or filters across the entire the code base for the file. So that's the first thing you're going to notice is this using alias. The second thing you're going to notice is this content importer attribute here. This attribute has to be on the importer class that's being used to import our content. If this attribute is not there, then the MGCB editor will not know that this class is an actual content importer. So we have the importer attribute. the first parameter in the attribute by default says .text. What this parameter does is this defines the file extension that our importer is going to be associated with. So by default, it's for .text files. Display name. The display name is a descriptive name that you can give your importer, and this will be the name that it displays in the MGCB editor as the name of the importer. By default, it's just importer one. That's not a very descriptive name, so we're going to want to change that to something more descriptive. The other property that is set in the attribute is the default processor. Now, the default processor that you set here is just the processor that's automatically selected in the MGCB editor when a content file is recognized that it's using this importer. They just selects this processor as the default one. It doesn't mean that it is the processor that it's going to use. Obviously, users can change which processor to use, but this just ensures that it's selecting the correct default processor in case we only have one processor type or one processor class in our extension to process our files. The next thing we're going to look at here, going over the anatomy of this class, is that our JSON content importer class is inheriting from the content importer base class, which comes from the Microsoft XNA framework content pipeline namespace. This specific class that we're importing from, it does require a generic type given to it. The type given here is going to be the type that is expected to be returned from our content importer when it finishes importing the file. So whatever data type we're returning, that's what we specify here, which is also going to affect and specify what we return from the import statement for the import method here. The next thing we have in here is the actual import method itself. The import method is overriding from the base class, and we get two parameters with this. We get a string containing the file name, and we get a content importer context, which just provides additional context things for the importer and allows us to add additional items to the content build. Those are more advanced use case scenarios. Those aren't going to be covered in this tutorial. But just I guess for an FYI, if you ever have a use case where you're importing a content file, and that content file also depends on external dependencies, external files also need to be imported with it, you can use this content importer context instance that we get here to add those external dependencies to be imported and processed and created as XMB files. But again, that's more of an advanced topic, and that's not something we're going to discuss in this tutorial video. So that is the anatomy of a that is the anatomy of the content importer class. So let's go ahead and edit this one now to make it work for what we want it to do in our example, which is going to be importing JSON files. So the first thing we're going to want to do is change the file type that is associated with. So we're going to change it from .text to .json, just like that. The next thing we're going to do is change the display name. We want to give us something a bit more descriptive than just importer one. So this is importing JSON files. So we can just call this JSON importer. And I'm going to put -arristurtle at the end here. The reason I'm doing that is it's generally common practice among third-party developers creating content pipeline extensions to for the display name, and this is going to be the display name for the importer as well as the processor, which we'll see in a minute, to add a hyphen at the end, and then either your name or the name of your library that you're creating or something like that, just so when people who are using it see that importer or the processor is available in the list, they can see where it came from. They know that this came from Arristurtle, from me, or that it came from whatever your library is if you use your library name. The next thing we're going to change is going to be the default processor, because we changed it from being called processor1 to JSON content processor. But we're not just going to type in the string JSON content processor. Instead, we're going to make use of the name of language feature of C#. So we're going to do name of JSON content processor. If you're not familiar with name of, what it does is basically at compile time, it will take the name of that, the thing that we put inside of the name of method here, and it will turn it into a string based off of its name. And it does that at compile time instead of runtime. So it's kind of less prone to typing errors. It's just a way of doing that. You don't have to use name of. You could just have type JSON content processor as a string there if you want to do. I prefer using name of. Just do whichever one you prefer doing. So with that done, we have fixed the attribute to specify that we're now importing JSON files. The next thing we need to do is actually import the JSON file, or write the code to import the JSON file. So we're going to return this, or delete this return statement. And then we're going to add the following code. So we're going to do string JSON equals file. We're going to add the system.io namespace. So file.read all text, and we're going to pass in the file name. The file name that's given to us here is the full path, the absolute path to the file being loaded. So we can just pass that in to the file read all text method, and it will read all the text, all the JSON from that, and store it into our JSON string. However, just reading it isn't going to be enough. How do we know that what we just read is actually valid JSON? How do we know it's not just an empty string? As part of the import process, we also need to validate that the data we're importing is the data we're expecting to be imported. And this kind of draws, there's kind of a fine line here when you're doing this type of validation in the importer, because you do want to validate what's being imported, but sometimes you do have to process that data a little bit in order to validate it. And it's okay to do that inside the importer so that we can validate what we're importing is actually what we need to import. But you can also move that validation logic over to the processor as well and just do it there. Either one's fine. It's really up to you, whichever one works better for you. I prefer, if I can, to do it inside the import method. That way, when an exception is thrown back to the user to let them know that the content isn't right, they see that the exception came from the import step and not the process step. So they knew the problem happened at import time. We recognize that the data was wrong. So we are going to do that. We're going to validate that this is, that the text we read from this file is actually a valid JSON string. And it can be deserialized from the JSON string into a JSON object. So to do that, we're going to add a new method here. It's going to be called throw if invalid JSON. Throw if invalid JSON, and we'll just pass in the JSON string to it. So first, we're going to make sure that the JSON isn't an empty string. So if string is null or empty JSON, then we're going to throw a new invalid content exception. Invalid content exception is an exception type that comes from the MonoGame framework content pipeline namespace. You can use this. You can use a normal standard exception. You can create your own exception, whichever one you want to use. I prefer to use the invalid content exception because it basically describes that this is invalid content. So I'm going to do the invalid content exception, and we're going to say the JSON file is empty. All right, so if it passes that check, if it's not an empty string, the next thing we're going to want to do is attempt to parse the actual JSON string data as a JSON document. And if that fails, then we know that there's something wrong with the JSON itself. Maybe it's improperly formatted. Maybe it has an extra character somewhere that it shouldn't. Something with the JSON is wrong and it can't be deserialized. And so we need to let the user know that we couldn't import it because the JSON was bad. So to do that, we're going to write a try catch block. And for the catch block, we're just going to catch any exception which generally people say don't use. They say catch specific exceptions, but in this case, we are just going to use a general exception catch-all, and I'll show you why. So inside of our try block, we're going to do a discard equal. If you're not familiar with doing discard equal, doing the underscore equal here just means that whatever method we're about to call and it returns something back, we're specifically telling it to just discard the return. We don't care about what it returns back. Just get rid of it, discard it. All we care about right now is that the method actually executes. So we're going to do JSON document, which is going to add the system text that JSON using statement for us at the top. So it's JSON document.parse, and then we're going to give it the JSON string. As long as that passes, we know that this is valid JSON. However, if this fails and it throws an exception and it's not valid JSON, then we need to let the user know we can't import this file because the JSON is invalid. So we'll throw a new invalid content exception here. And we'll say this does not appear to be a valid JSON file. See inner exception for details. And then we'll give it the exception that was called as the inner exception that they can explore for further details on why the content wasn't valid or why it could be parsed as a JSON file. So now that we have our method for validating the JSON, let's come up here and actually validate it. So throw if invalid JSON, pass it the JSON string. As long as that passes and no exceptions are thrown, then control will be returned back after the method call. And then we can just return the JSON string itself, and that's it. That's all we need for our JSON content importer. So we have, we are reading the content of the file. We are validating that it's actually valid JSON that we can process in the processor in a few minutes. And then if it is, we return back the JSON string. Now, when we return the JSON string from here, this value that's returned is going to get passed to the content processor. So let's step over now to the content processor and kind of go over the anatomy of it, and then do the edits to the content processor that we'll need in order to process our JSON file. So here's the content processor. This is the template that you get by default when you created the project. Just like the content importer, we also have the using aliases here. Only the content processor has two using aliases. It has one for the input type and one for the output type, because the processor has to take something in that it got from the importer, and then it has to send something out that it's going to send out to the content writer that writes our data to the XMB file. So one thing I want to specify here real quick before we dive further into the anatomy of the content processor is that by default, the output it gives you in the template is the string. And since we're dealing with JSON, and JSON is just a string value that we've read in, it would make sense to just have the input be a string and the output be a string. However, there are other built-in content processors and writers in MonoGame that use string as the output type. And because there are already existing ones that are part of the framework built into it that use that string type, we actually can't use string as our output type. So instead, what we need to do is we need to create another class model or data transfer object, whatever you want to call it. We need to create another class that's going to hold the data that we get out of the processor, and then we can use that to pass to the writer for the output. So we'll create that in a minute. I just want you to be aware of that for the output type from the processor, we can't use string because it will conflict with other built-in processors and writers in the framework, and you'll get an error saying that the file couldn't be processed because the return type was string, and there's already entries in the MGCB that are returning string. So just something to be aware of. So going further into this, we do have the two using aliases at the top for the input and output. We also have a content processor attribute that is applied to the class here. Just like the importer, we do have to have a content processor attribute applied to our content processor. Otherwise, the MonoGame Content Builder will not recognize this as an actual processor to use to process content. This one's a little bit simpler than the content importer. The only property to set for the attribute is the display name. And this display name is the same as the one for the importer. It's just a descriptive name that gets displayed in the MGCB editor when the user goes to pick this processor to process the content. So just like the importer, we're going to use a similar name for our processor, and that's going to be JSON content processor. And we're going to do the hyphen Eris turtle because we want them to know where this processor came from. Okay, so the next part of the processor class to look at is going to be that we are inheriting from the content processor base class, which comes from the Microsoft XNA Framework Content Pipeline namespace. This processor base class does have two generic types that has to be defined on it. One is the input and one is the output. And this just defines what type of content the content processor expects to be sent as the input to the processor, and the output defines what type is expected to be returned from the processor once it finishes processing the data. And these are using the T input and T output aliases that are set up here, which we'll adjust that output in a minute because of that issue I spoke of, but we'll get that in a second. Outside of the class declaration, the only other thing we have in a content processor is the actual process method itself that's overriding from the base class. This method gives us two parameters. The first one is our input, and this is the input that's being sent to the processor from the importer. And the other one is a content processor context. Just like the importer, this content processor context provides additional context for the processing part, typically used to allow us to add external dependencies that are going to be built alongside of our content. However, again, this is more of an advanced topic and it's out of scope for this tutorial, so we're not really going to cover that, but just be aware that that is a parameter that's part of this and can be used for that if you want to do research further on your own before I make a future tutorial on advanced topics for that. So that is the anatomy of a content processor for our extension. As I mentioned, we do need to change the output type to be some type of like model class that we can wrap our data in that gets exported. So let's go ahead and do that now. Let's create a model class real quick. So we're going to right click on the project and go to add class. And we're going to name our class JSON content processor result. And we're just going to delete these namespaces up here because we don't need them. And we're going to add two properties to this. And one of them is going to make sense. The other one, I'll explain in a minute what that property is. But we're going to add two properties to our content processor result. The first one is going to be a string, which is going to be the actual JSON value or the JSON string that we processed. The second one we're going to add is another string. And this one I'm going to call the runtime identifier. Runtime identifier. There we go. That's going to be an important property. And I'll explain that once we get to it in a few moments. But just know that we're going to need that data from our processor. So now that we have this class created, the JSON content processor class, let's go over to our content processor itself and change this output type from system string to the JSON content processor result. And it does have to be specified as the fully qualified namespace or type with the namespace and the type. So now we've specified that our output is a JSON content processor result. So now in our processor method, we actually need to construct an instance of that JSON content processor result. So to do this, we could just simply create a new instance of the JSON content processor result. JSON content processor result equals new JSON. Let's go to T output, whatever. Result, and then we can say result.json equals the input that we got from the importer, because it's just the JSON string, and then we can return the result back, and that's it. This is like the bare minimum that we would need to do. However, we're actually doing zero processing. There's no processing being done at all here. And you can argue that for JSON, there's very minimal, if any at all, processing that needs to be done. We really just need to get the string in and write the string out. However, there are things we can do with JSON content to process it from its raw version to the XMB version that can change the way the content is stored. One of those things we can do is that we can ensure that the JSON string itself has been minified. So it removes any of the new line entries in the file, which reduces the file size or reduces the size of the string that we're going to eventually have to write out to our XMB file. So we can add a step in here to minify this by first adding a public property to our content processor. I will call this public bool minify, and it needs to be a property. And by default, we'll set it to true. And then we're going to add a display name attribute to the minify property. And we're just going to call it minify JSON. And what this does is by adding properties to our content processor, these properties will also be shown in the MGCB editor that users can use to configure how their content is being processed. The display name attribute allows us to give a descriptive name to what is shown in the MGCB editor for this specific property. And we'll see what those look like a little bit later when we actually get into the MGCB editor part and start working with it. So we'll add the minify property, and we're going to go ahead and add now the string runtime identifier. Like I said, this is going to be important in a few moments. It's a little bit early to explain why this is important, but this is important specifically for the JSON importing, not important for creating a content pipeline extension itself. This is something very specific to the JSON importing, which is why we have to add this. But I'll explain this a little bit more in a few minutes on why we need that once we get to the actual content writer, because it'll make more sense then once we get there. So let's give this a display name of runtime identifier. And now let's adjust our process method so that we're actually going to process the JSON in case the user would like to minify it. Yeah, let's do that. All right, so we'll say if minify. We'll do input equals minify JSON. Make sure I spell that right, minify JSON. And we'll pass in the input to that. Now let's come down here and create our method for that. Private string minify JSON. String JSON. There we go. And to minify the JSON, it's actually not that difficult in C#. You can follow along with the code I'm writing here. This is just this isn't specific for content pipeline extensions. This is what we're doing right now, specific for minifying JSON. So if you're interested in it, you can follow along. If not, you can kind of ignore this part of the video. You can fast forward a little bit if you want. But to minify it, first we're going to create JSON writer options. And these options, we're going to specify that indented is going to be false. Next, we're going to create a memory string with a using statement. Let me scroll this down a little bit so you can see it better. So using memory string. Use new memory string. And then we're going to create a UTF-8 JSON writer. We're going to do that in a using statement as well. So using UTF-8 JSON writer equals new writer, and we'll pass it the string. And then inside of this, we're going to, oops, I forgot. Very sorry. Before this, we need to create a JSON document. JSON document equals new, or not new, but equals JSON document parse, and we're going to tell it to parse the JSON that we were given. Okay, so down here inside of the using block for the writer, we're going to tell it to take the doc and write it to the writer itself. And then we're going to tell the writer to flush. And then we're going to come down here inside the other using block, and we're going to return the memory stream, but we need to return it as a string. So we're going to return encoding that UTF-8 get string, and we'll do stream.toArray. And there we go. Using this method, we can minify the JSON string and return it back here. So now we have the ability to minify that JSON string. So we're actually are processing, or have the ability to process the JSON content. It's not just reading the string and passing it around. We're actually doing some type of processing to it. So along with that, we also have this runtime identifier property that we created. Again, this property is going to be important in a few minutes, which will make more sense once we get into the JSON content writer. But for now, just be aware it exists and know that for JSON content itself, this is something that we're going to need to require the users to actually set a value. They're going to have to put a value, configure a value manually in the MGCB editor for this. So we need to make sure that the user actually did configure a value for that. And if they didn't, we need to throw an exception to let them know, hey, you didn't configure a value for this property. We need you to do that. Please go do that. Otherwise, we can't process this content. So to do that, right here at the start of the process, we're just going to check if they actually provided us with a runtime identifier by doing if string is null or empty runtime identifier. And if it is null or empty, we'll throw an exception. New exception. And we'll say no runtime identifier was specified for this JSON content. So that just lets you know, hey, you didn't specify a runtime identifier for this content for the processor. And there we go. That is our JSON content processor, part of our content pipeline extension. So just to go over, recap very quickly, what we did is we adjusted the T output alias here to use our JSON content processor result class that we created. We changed the display name to be something much more descriptive for the user, much easier to identify what the processor actually is. We added two properties to our JSON content processor. One that allows the user to configure whether the JSON should be minified or not. And the other one, which is where the user will specify a runtime identifier that we'll use later in the content writer and the content reader. And then in our process method itself, we just check that the runtime identifier property was actually supplied because we're going to require it. If they didn't supply it, we throw an exception. Then we check if the user wants to minify the JSON. And if they do, we go through the process of minifying the JSON itself. Once that's done, we create our JSON content processor result instance. We add the the input to the JSON for that. We also need to add the runtime identifier. We had to do that here. Add the runtime identifier, probably do that, and then we return our result back. And that's it. That's our JSON content processor. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Nothing really too crazy about it. So now we need to move over into the content writer. And the content writer is the part that is responsible for exporting our processed content to the XMB file. However, the problem we now face is the MonoGame Content Pipeline extension template does not give us a content writer class by default. So this is something we're going to have to create manually. So to do that, we're just going to add a new class file, and we're going to call this class file JSON content type writer. And then we're going to remove the using statements up here, and we're going to add the using statements that we're going to need. So we're going to be using Microsoft.xna.framework.content.pipeline. We're also going to need the using Microsoft XNA.framework content pipeline serialization.compiler. So these are the two namespaces we need to import for this. The next thing we need to do is come down to our class here and give it an attribute, which is going to be the content type writer attribute. This one, unlike the processor and the importer, actually has no fields or parameters or properties that we need to specify on it. We only need to give it the attribute itself. That's it. No further configurations, only the attribute itself. For our class, we're going to need our class to inherit from content typewriter. And the content typewriter does have a generic type that it needs specified for what the input is. So just like with the importer and the processor, we're going to create a using alias that we can use called tinput. So let's come up here now and create that using tinput equals, and this needs to be this alias needs to be the type that is returned from our content processor. If you remember from our content processor, we set it so that it's returning a JSON content processor result. So that's what we'll set it here, is JSON content processor result. There we go. And now we have our class declaration created, our JSON content typewriter inheriting from the content typewriter, using the tinput alias as the type that is expecting to be input into the writer. To make things easy, we're just going to click on the writer itself, which is highlighted with the squiggly lines with all the errors. We're going to click on that. I hit Control period, which is going to give us this option, and we're going to choose the implement abstract class, which is going to implement the two methods that we need in order to create the content type writer. So the first method we're going to look at is this get runtime reader. This method is super important. Out of all the things that you're going to do when creating a content pipeline extension, this single method right here will probably be your greatest source of frustration until you understand exactly what you need to do with it and what it does. So to explain that, we need to back up a little bit and talk about this write method right here. So this write method is given an instance of a content writer. The content writer class that it's given, if we go to definition here, we can see that this content writer is just a subclass of a binary writer. So it's just a binary writer, which allows us to write content out to as binary encoded to a file. But the content writer itself also provides overloads for the write method that writes MonoGame specific data types, such as vector2, vector3, vector4, matrix, things like that. But along with that, when this content writer instance is created internally inside the framework, it does two things during the creation period. The first thing it does is it writes a small header, a small signature to the header of the XMB file that's being created. That kind of identifies this as an XMB file. It's just a small signature. It's the letters X and B. And that's how content readers later will know when it's reading in that it's reading in a valid XMB file. The next thing it writes to the XMB file after that signature in the header is going to be the type of reader that should be used in order to read this actual content that's being written to the XMB file. And that value that it gets for the type of reader to use, it gets that value from this get runtime reader. And the value that is given has to be very specific. It has to be the fully qualified type name of the reader being used to read the content. If you're not familiar with what a fully qualified type name path is, it's basically, it's going to be a string, and the string is going to be in the format of type path within the assembly that it's in, comma, space, the assembly name itself. That is the type path. However, or not however, let's explain this real quick. As an actual example of what a fully qualified type path would be, let's take this JSON content typewriter class that we have here. So if we were creating a fully qualified type path to this JSON content typewriter, we have to do the type path, comma, assembly. So to do that, the string would look like this. It would be the full path to the type, which is JSON content pipeline extension dot, that's the namespace that's in, dot JSON content type writer. So that's our type path, and then comma the name of the assembly, which is JSON content pipeline extension. So this is what a fully qualified type path would look like. It's the full path within the assembly to that type, comma, then the name of the assembly. However, we're gonna, for our JSON content importing, we're actually gonna make this a bit simpler. We're actually not gonna have to type anything there, not gonna be any guesswork on our end. We're going to put this burden on the actual user itself, specifically because we're importing JSON and how JSON deserializing is going to work later. We kind of don't know ahead of time what that reader should be, if that makes sense. Like it's going to be a little bit hard to specify the specific reader here without creating tons and tons and tons of content reader types later. So for now, we're just going to leave this method alone, and we're going to come down to the write method itself. So the write method itself is responsible for writing out the content that was processed to the XMB file itself. As I mentioned before, the write method receives the content writer instance, which is just a binary writer. So we can just use it the same way we would use the binary writer to write the content out to the file. So for instance, since we need to write the JSON string, we can just do output.write. And then we take our input value and we write the JSON string. Just like that. Easy peasy. Let's delete this throw line. And that's it. That's all we need to write. We've written the JSON string. Nothing else needs to be written. If you were doing a more complex scenario where you were writing lots of different types of values out, One thing to note is that the order that you write these values out in, you need to read the values in the same exact order in the content reader later. But for the JSON content, all we need to do is write out the JSON string itself. So now we need to fix this get runtime reader part. And to do that, we're going to add a private string here, and it's going to be called runtime identifier. And then in our write method, we're going to assign a value to that runtime identifier. And that's going to come from the value runtime identifier that was given to us during the processing stage. And then in the get runtime reader method itself, we're just going to return the runtime identifier that we were given. So this is going to require the user to actually enter the fully qualified type path for the reader to use in order to read their JSON content in their game. Which is fine. It's just how it has to be with JSON content. This isn't something you would normally have to do with other content types, but this is just a very specific thing for JSON content because of the way deserializing the content works, because it can be deserialized into any type of object. So we have no way of really specifying universally just generic object for the JSON importer. With that out of the way, that is it. That is all we need at a base for our JSON content pipeline extension itself. Now we need to add a new kind of like a middleware piece that's going to exist between the content pipeline extension and our game projects. So to do that, let's right click on the solution and go to add new project. And for this new project, we are going to choose, let's scroll down here. We're going to choose the MonoGame, I just saw it, MonoGame game library. Make sure it is the game library one and not the shared library project. We don't want the shared one, we want specifically the game library one. So choose that. And I'm going to call this one just JSON content pipeline. Because this deals with the pipeline itself, but it's not a pipeline extension like the other one is. So I'm just going to call this JSON content pipeline. And we're going to hit create. And it creates our project for us. You can see it over here. It gives us a content folder and a game1 class file. Now, typically when you're creating MonoGame game libraries, it is useful to have the content folder and the game class file that it gives you. However, for our purposes, for creating a content pipeline extension, we don't need those. So we are just going to delete them. Just like that. Now they're gone. Bye. And then we're going to add a new class to it. A new class. And we're going to call this JSON content type reader. And this class is going to be what is responsible for actually reading the XML file at runtime in our game when we use the content load method. So let's go over real quick creating a content reader. We're going to delete these namespaces at the top. We're going to add using Microsoft.xna.framework.content. We're going to need that. We're also going to need, I believe we're going to need the system. Maybe we don't. We'll see. Now, let's make this a public class because by default it created it as internal. We're going to need this to be public. We're also going to specify that this takes in a generic type T. And we're going to inherit from the content type reader class, which also takes a generic type T. And then we can come over to the JSON content reader, hit control period, go to implement abstract interface, and it will implement for us the default read method that we're going to need to actually create or add logic to read our JSON content in. So for now, it just throws a new throws a non-implemented exception. Let's delete that and kind of go over what this method is real quick. So, like I mentioned, this method is going to be what reads the XMB file from disk and transforms it into the content type that we're expected to be loaded in our game. It's given an instance of the content reader class called input. The content reader class, just like the content writer was, if we go to definition, we can see that the content reader is just an implementation of binary reader that adds a few things in that allows reading specific MonoGame type data types like the vector2, vector3s, matrices, things like that. Along with this, when the content reader is first created, it does read the small header information that's written in the XMB file. So once we get to this point in this method, we are already at the point where we are only reading from the start of our data that we originally wrote. And remember, as I mentioned before, when you write multiple things in the content writer earlier, you're going to need to ensure that the order you write that data in the writer is the same order that you read it in inside the reader. Fortunately, we only need to read the JSON string. We only have one thing that we actually need to read. So let's go ahead and add that. So we're going to read a JSON string from the input. So string JSON input read string. There we go. And we know, because this is our JSON content type reader, that we're going to be returning some type of JSON object that's going to be deserialized. So we're going to do t result equals JSON serializer dot deserialize type t, and we're going to give it the JSON, and then we return the result. And that's it. We actually didn't need the system. Here at the top, let's remove that. But that's it for that. So this is our JSON content type reader. Just to briefly go over it again, it inherits from any content type reader that you create needs to inherit from the content type reader class in the Microsoft XNA framework content namespace. The content type reader class itself requires a generic type or type specification for the type of content it's expected to return once it's been read. And then you need to specifically have an override for the read method from the base class. And inside that read method is where we actually perform the reading of the content of the XMB file, and then taking the data that we read and turning it into the object or instance type that's expected to be returned from the method, which is what we've done here. We read the JSON file in, we then deserialize that using the system text.json serializer, and then once it's deserialized, we return the result. And that's it. That's it for our content type reader. All we have to do. Now, to answer the burning question that you have, why did we put the JSON content type reader in a completely separate project from our JSON content pipeline extension, which contains the importer, processor, and writer? And that's a very good question. That's a very good question to ask. If you weren't asking that question, you should have been asking that question. So to explain why we're doing that, the importer, the processor, and the writer that exists inside of our JSON content pipeline extension here, none of these classes have a dependency on that JSON content type reader. They don't care about it. They don't know about it. They have no dependency to it. They don't need to know about it. So there's no reason to include it in the same library. However, the game that we create that's going to use this will need to know about the JSON content type reader. The game itself does not need to know about the importer, processor, and the writer. The game doesn't care about that. Those are going to be important for the MonoGame Content Builder MGCB Editor, but not our game. So by putting our type reader in its own inside of its own project here, we can then use this project as a reference to our game. So our game gets the reference to the type reader, and that keeps it separate from all the other dependencies and classes that are going to be used by the actual MGCB editor itself for the importer, processor, and the writer. Hopefully that made sense. If it doesn't, feel free to yell at me on Discord or Twitter and let me know that I made absolutely no sense when I explained that, and I'll try to explain it better. But for now, that's the explanation I'm giving. So with this, the way this is set up now with our content type reader, our importer, processor, and our writer, we've basically created a content pipeline extension. This is it. This is all it takes to create one. But we need to go one step further and actually show using this content pipeline extension that we've created in an actual game scenario to prove that it works. I guess we need to prove that what we've done now actually works. So to do that, let's add a new MonoGame project to our solution. So we're going to right click the solution, go to add new project, and then I'm going to select the MonoGame cross-platform desktop application, the desktop GL, OpenGL MonoGame project template. So we're going to hit next. I'm just going to keep this simple. I'm going to call it example game because I'm not very creative. Hit create, and here's our game. It's now been added to our solution. The first thing we're going to need to do, because remember, our game needs to know about the content type reader in the other project. It needs to know about the reader. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to right click on the project, go to add project reference, and then we're just going to select the JSON content pipeline project, the one that contains our reader. We're only going to select that one, and then we're going to click OK. So now our game has a reference to the project with the reader in it. So now it knows about the reader and it can use the reader. The next thing we need to do is set up the content pipe, or not the content pipe, I'm sorry, the MGCB editor to have a reference to our content pipeline extension that contains the importer, processor, and the writer. So to do that, we're going to open up the content MGCB file, which is going to throw an error because the current version of Visual Studio is broken. This is not a MonoGame issue. That error that pops up is not a MonoGame issue. That is a Visual Studio issue, and it has been fixed. As the time of this recording, it is fixed in the Visual Studio 17.8 preview release, but not in the official 17.8 release that hasn't come out yet. So for now, we still have to deal with that annoying error pop up. But anyway, let's move past that. So once we get the MGCB editor open, what we're going to do is we're going to click on content. We're going to go down to references here in the properties, which is going to open the reference editor. And just to show this real quick, when you click this, you can't click the word references here. This is not where you click. You need to click here where it says none. You need to click the actual field. And this is going to open up the reference editor where we can add a DLL reference to our MGCB editor. So we're going to click add, and then we're going to go back a couple of folders to the JSON content pipeline extension. In debug. Oh, and it's not here, and that's because we never told it to build. So let's tell it to build real quick. So we're going to right click the pipeline extension. We're going to tell it to build. It is built, and so now we have, here it is, the DLL here. So we're going to select that DLL. We're going to hit open. We're going to hit OK. And now if I expand this out, bring this down a bit, or I didn't have to bring it down, but you can see here now we have a reference to the JSON content pipeline extension, which is cool. So let's save, click save here, or you can click file save on our content MGCB, and you can either leave the window open as it is right now, minimize it, or you can close it, whichever one you want to do. I'm going to minimize it so we don't have to deal with that error again later. But you do what you want to do, whatever you feel like doing. So now we need to actually create the JSON file that we're going to be importing. So let's right click on our content folder, go to add new item, and we're just going to call this example.json, because it's just an example JSON file for our example game. That's all it is. We're going to click add. And for the JSON itself, I actually have this in the tutorial that I wrote. So I'm going to copy and paste it so I don't have to sit here and type it all out. It's very simple JSON. Here it is, copy and pasted. This JSON contains 4 properties, a name property, health, defense, and attack. These are just made up properties. These are some things you may use in a game sometimes. Your character may have health, it may have a name, it may have a defense stat, it may have an attack stat, whatever. This is just an example JSON. Don't overanalyze this. But this is the example that we're going to use. Now, when we deserialize JSON into an actual object in C#, we need an object that's going to match that JSON file that we're deserializing. So along with this JSON file, we also need to create a new class in our game that matches the same structure. So I'm going to right click on the game, example game project, going to add new class, and I'm just going to call this example model. Get rid of all these using statements we don't need, clean those up. And this needs to match the JSON. So I'm going to pull over here. So again, the JSON has name, health, defense, and attack. Name is a string, and the other 3 are integers. So we can do public string name, and then public integer health, public integer defense, and public integer attack. So with that set up, we now have a model class in our game that matches the same schema as our JSON file that we're going to be importing, so that that JSON file can be deserialized into an instance of this class. Now, there's one more thing we need to do. This thing we need to do is specific to this JSON example for importing JSON. This is not something specific to content pipelines extensions themselves, but it is something that's specific to importing JSON that we need to do in order to actually make the JSON importing work. So if you recall earlier, when we created the JSON writer, pull that up here, I told you that the get runtime reader has to return a value that's exact, and that value it returns has to be the runtime path of the content reader that's going to be used in order to read the XMB file. The problem is, for our JSON content reader, let's go look at it. The problem is our JSON content reader class has a type parameter attached to it, which is going to make it very tricky for us to define the type or the content reader type used for that specific JSON file, because this JSON file is going to be for our example model we created, but we might have JSON files for other type of models, which means the content reader has no way of or not the content reader, but the content typewriter has no way of differentiating all those different types of models that we're going to be deserializing our JSON to. So to get around that, what we're going to need to do is, for each model type we want to deserialize the JSON to, We just need to create a real quick, very simple class that inherits from our JSON content type writer, and use that as the reader that's going to read the file. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. So to do that in our example game, we're just going to add a new class, and we're going to call this class the example model type reader. Remove these unnecessary using statements. And then this is a really simple class. All we're going to do is inherit from the JSON content type reader, and we're going to give it the type as example model, because that is the type that this reader is expected to read in and return when it reads the XMB file. So we'll save that. We have our example model type reader here. So now we need to actually add our JSON file to the MGCB editor so it can be imported and processed into our game. So let's go back to the MGCB editor. Hopefully you still have it open. If not, you'll need to double click the content MGCB file and then click OK on that annoying warning that Visual Studio is giving right now. And then you'll have your the MGCB editor open on the content file. And from here, you can click on the content node and go to add, right click on it and go to add existing item. And then we're going to select our example JSON file that we created earlier. And when we click on that, you can already see here that now it has selected our JSON importer that we created and our JSON content processor that we created, and it's got the display name that we set for it. We can also see that we have the processing parameters that we created, the minified JSON, which can be set to true or false, and the runtime identifier, which the user, again, we said has to specify. Now, for the runtime identifier, for this particular one, we need to use the runtime identifier for this example model type reader here, which is part of our example game class. So to do that, we first have to give it the full path to this example model type reader. So it's going to be example game dot example model type reader, and then comma, and then the name of the assembly that's in, which is going to be example game. And that's it. That's all we need to input for the runtime identifier here. So now if we hit save and we build our content, we can see here the content was built successfully. So that's always a good sign. So now let's make sure we can actually load the content in. Let's go to our game class. We're going to double click on game one here. We're going to come down to the load content method right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to say example model equals content dot load example model. And we want this example model to be loaded from our example JSON file. So we're just going to say example as our content path. And I'm going to put a breakpoint right here on where it's loading the content in. And then we're going to right click on our game and go to debug and start a new instance. And let's see what happens. All right, so the breakpoint has been hit right here on the content load. If we step into that, we can see that it now goes to our JSON content type writer, and it reads the string, it deserializes it, it returns the result. Let's step one further past that, and let's look at the result of our model here. And we can see the values that we read in. The attack is 20, the defense is 50, the health is 100, and the name is Eris Turtle. And does this match the actual JSON that we had? Yes, it does. Name Eris Turtle, health 100, defense 50, attack 20. So there we go. We have created a custom JSON content importer for the MGCB editor. Feel free to use this for whatever projects, or if you have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to me on this. But hopefully with this video, you also gain a little bit more understanding of the steps that it takes to create a content pipeline extension and the anatomy of each of the different parts: the content importer, the content processor, the content typewriter, and the content type reader that you need to create in order to provide all the necessary steps in that workflow for the content pipeline itself. So with that said, I'm going to leave in the video here and leave you once again with this QR code that you can scan. Again, this QR code is for the MonoGame Discord. It's the invite link to the Discord. Feel free to come by and join it. If you're not in the Discord, come by and say hello. Ask any questions you have on using MonoGame, any problems you're running into while creating your game. We're very active on the Discord. We're always willing to help in any way that we can, if we can help, if we're knowledgeable about it. If we're not knowledgeable about the subject of your question, we usually know someone that we can point you to or call in to add supplemental details or to give some supplemental help. So please join the MonoGame Discord. Come by, say hi. If you have any questions about this tutorial specifically, you can join the Discord and contact me there. Other than that, I hope you have a great day or evening, whatever it is for you right now. For me, it is 4:26 in the morning. It is way too late, and I need to be going to bed. So with that, I'm going to sign off. Hope you all have a great day.